Hello and welcome. This is Jennifer Laszlo Mizrahi from RespectAbility, and I'm absolutely delighted that you've decided to join us for this really interesting webinar today on some proven best practices that I think will get you very excited about the wonderful work that's being done by Gateways Access to Jewish Education in Boston, work that we believe can be and should be replicated in other places. RespectAbility is a nonprofit organization. We are not partisan, and we don't have any sort of affiliation with Gateways in terms of any profit-making motives. We're just in the business of finding great ideas and sharing great ideas with terrific people like those of you who've joined us for this webinar today. We have the pleasure of working with Gateways and with the Jewish Federation of Greater Washington on some really nice, innovative ideas that are being done in the field, and so we're delighted that today we're bringing you the program called Mitzvah Mensches. Now, we recognize that many of the people who are listening to the webinar today are not Jewish, and so you might not know what the term Mitzvah Mensches mean. Well, it's a Hebrew word, and Hebrew for mitzvah means good deed or commandment, and Mensches are people who are good people, who are nice people, and so this is a really nice way to call the program Mitzvah Mensches. But essentially, it's a program of good deeds that is by and for people with and without disabilities who are treated totally equally through this program. So it's a terrific pre-employment program for people with disabilities. It's a fabulous opportunity for people without disabilities to have the pleasure and experience of working with talented people with disabilities. We've got two experts who are going to walk us through their groundbreaking work. The first is Arlene, who is the Executive Director of Gateways Access to Jewish Education, the central organization for Jewish special education in Greater Boston. She began her career in special ed as a counselor at the Tikva program at Camp Rema in New England, but for many years of her professional life in special ed was separate from her volunteer work in the Jewish community. But through Gateways, she's brought together these two passions, working to ensure that every child can access their religious education, so bringing together both the disability work and the faith-based work in the same way. Nancy Mager is the Director of Jewish Education Programs for Gateways and has worked in the field of special education as a teacher and consultant and administrator for over 20 years. Nancy has extensive training and experience in autism spectrum disorders, applied behavioral analysis, and social thinking. She holds a master's in education from Simmons College through the New England Center for Children's Partnership Program and a Bachelor of Arts degree in psychology from Boston University. And day to day, she is managing this innovative, groundbreaking program that, again, we believe is something that should be replicated across the country and broadly, both inside and outside of the faith-based communities. So I turn it over to the two of you to take us on this journey. Thank you very much for being our speakers today.
Thank you, Jennifer. This is Arlene. As Jennifer mentioned, Gateways is the central organization for Jewish special education in Boston, and what we do is we provide educational programs and support services for students with disabilities, as well as professional development for educators, and we provide that in multiple settings, in Jewish day schools, in Hebrew and religious schools, and in preschools throughout the greater Boston area. Amongst our programs are those that focus specifically on disability awareness, on training and inclusion, on peer and leadership development for teens, really helping all teens, both those with and without disabilities, to become better citizens in an inclusive world. Today, in a moment, I'm going to turn it over to Nancy, who's going to share with you one of our programs, which we call Mitzvah Mensches. Mitzvah Mensches is an inclusive teen youth group program where the overt curriculum curriculum, as Nancy will explain, is teen philanthropy. However, the underlying curriculum is the development of social skills. Really, the overall goal is creating a successful social environment, a meaningful and successful social environment for teens, both with and without disabilities. At this point, let me turn it over to Nancy.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Arlene, and thank you, Jennifer. It's a pleasure to be here. Mitzvah Mensches is, as you heard, our inclusive philanthropic youth group, and we have teens that join us from the age of 13 all the way through high school, and they come to us through a variety of channels and for a variety of reasons. Some of the teens come to us because they need community service hours, and because we're a philanthropic group, that qualifies. Others are coming because they want to engage with people with various abilities or disabilities and find us through that channel. And other people come because they have a disability, and it's a place that welcomes them as well as provides support and accommodation so that they can be fully included in all of the activities. But one of my favorite things that someone said upon joining the group is they wanted to join it because they thought it was important that groups like this exist. And after being there for a while, the young teenager has really come to love the group for many more reasons than that. But I thought that was a particularly interesting reason for wanting to join, that he felt that it was an important thing to support and to say there should be more things like this that exist and available to teens. So we have a philosophy that we use to plan our activities, to plan our year, and to support all participants. So first, we have to give the teens, both with and without disabilities, who may not always have much in common, at least in the beginning, we have to give them a reason to be together. And so we do that, as you'll see coming up, with finding things that they care about as a group and in giving them shared unique experiences so that they have something meaningful to talk about. And while we're doing that, as Arlene mentioned, we're giving them the tools to give back. We're teaching them about the social skills they will need in order to participate in philanthropy. And all teens are really empowered to make a difference. What's interesting is for some of our teenagers who have a disability, they've been in school and are always on the receiving end of getting help. They're very infrequently given the opportunity to help someone else. And for most people, getting help and asking for help is not easy to do. It's a lot easier to give help than to ask for it or to be on the receiving end. So it's really empowering for many of our teens to be able to truly give back in a way that matters. So as I said, we embed social skills within social action projects. And what that does is it gives everyone the ability to participate, not always in the same way, but everyone can participate. And it builds this community of like-minded teens, of teens that are now caring about similar things, that are having joint experiences that are really interesting and unique. And we do so by structuring the activities using both visual supports, physical accommodations, technology, things like that, and often break up into small group work and then come together with the larger group to share our accomplishments. But the projects are all very meaningful to the teens and done in a really teen-friendly way. So we tend to do things sometimes that are a little silly, a little out of the ordinary, but by doing so, it really allows the teens to be willing to take risks and to trust one another, to support each other, and to think outside of the box. So the first thing we do is try to build a community and give teens something to talk about. So as we're finding out what they care about, we are planning teen-friendly, typical youth group activities that create these shared experiences. So in the upper left corner, you see a kid blowing a bubble, and that was part of a game that they had, a big bubble blowing contest. Again, not something so out of the ordinary, but when you have two kids that don't have a lot in common and don't have much to talk about, at least initially, and then you put them together doing something sort of silly or ridiculous, or in the right-hand side where you see them holding a 12-foot-long snake, suddenly they have something to talk about. In the lower portion of the screen, there are some candles burning in some donuts. So at Hanukkah time, in December, it's traditional to light what we call a menorah, and it's also traditional to eat donuts. When we have a snack with the teens, we always try and be a little creative, and they have to figure out how the snack corresponds with our activities. So here we made that menorah out of donuts. And then the final picture on the left, lower left, the teens had 18 minutes to build the tallest sculpture they could out of spaghetti sticks, a yard of string, and a yard of tape, and balance a marshmallow on it. So it required some communication, some collaboration, and we specifically pair teams together with various abilities so that there are different strengths in the group and different areas of challenge in the group. So they really have to support one another. And not only does it give them unique shared experiences and things to talk about, which is really helpful for those sort of awkward moments when something isn't so structured, but they start to trust one another and start to understand what each other's abilities are and what they might need help with, which really comes in handy as we start to do more meaningful projects throughout the year. So the next thing is that we're structuring everything for success. So we try to level the playing field by having multiple accommodations. There's always a schedule that's posted up on the board so everyone knows what's happening and when it's happening. We have them placed around the room as well. And so that's very helpful for kids or teenagers or anyone that likes to know what's happening in advance. And here you can see the schedule does leave a little bit of mystery to it, where it doesn't exactly say what's going on, but allows the kids, again, to have a conversation about what does that mean. And we are just sort of setting the stage to foster social interactions, as well as give support for predictability for kids who really need it sometimes. Here's another example of a visual support where the teens were decorating cookies to demonstrate an interest that they had. So we use about 14 different initial organizational themes to help guide us in picking a philanthropy or cause we care about. In this particular lesson, the teens had narrowed down their interest to the environment, Israel, or children. And so this was a voting activity rather than just raising your hand to cast a vote or writing it down on a slip of paper. For snacks that night, we were decorating cookies, but they, before they could eat the cookies, had to cast their vote by decorating it to represent one of those three themes. But again, rather than just telling people what to do, we created visual support so that everyone would understand what the step-by-step instructions were. The next thing that is important is finding out what matters to the teens. So on the next two slides, you will see two versions of the exact same questions. This first slide asks the teens, what kind of giver are you? Like, what way do you want to give back to the community? And it's written mostly with words for someone who can read and answer questions. On the next slide, you'll see it's the exact same questions, and I'll toggle between the two in a minute so you can compare and contrast. But it's the exact same questions, however, the answers have picture symbols to support readers who are just emerging as readers or might need a picture cue to sort of help them understand the context of language. And I'll toggle back now for a minute. So this is an example of ways of supporting multiple learners. This also would have other variations for students that maybe need to access this through technology, to sort of hear a question out loud and have it repeated again. I don't have that example for you today, but you can use your imagination that this could be put onto, an iPad or a computer and could be read aloud, and someone could replay the question as many times as they needed. This is an example of how we start our year and come back to this actually multiple times throughout the year. So this is a graphic organizer that helps guide both the teens in the philanthropy group and us in figuring out what we want to support, what kind of organizations we want to support, and what we are going to do to support them. So let me see if I can get my pointer up here. Here we go, my red dot. It's my first time doing a webinar, so bear with me. You'll see here at the top, these top 3 boxes where the red dot is, says theme. And this is where we narrow down from about 14 different themes to the top 3. Themes are things that are problems in the world that exist.
And just to interject, the 14 came from the kids themselves, the group. They generated them through a series of activities.
Absolutely. So before the year starts, we're doing, or as the year really begins, we're doing a lot of games and activities where kids are telling us what they're interested in. And from that, we're pulling out some themes that might relate to problems. So it could be technology, it could be health, it could be children, animals. Those would all be typical themes. And then we would get down to our top 3 themes, and that's when this chart would come into the classroom and remain there for the year. Once we've identified a couple of themes that the teens have told us they are interested in, we move down to the organizational level. And here, the educators typically are finding organizations that are in line with the theme. Once in a while, teens do come to us and say, I have a nonprofit that I've supported the past few years or that I'm really interested in. Can we learn about and support that philanthropy or that nonprofit? So sometimes that happens and it aligns. Other times it's educators that behind the scenes are finding organizations that are in line with the themes that the teens are interested in. And as educators, what we're looking for in organizations are places that need help in some way, ways that we can give back. And at Mitzvah Mensches, we teach the teens that for our purposes, there are 3 ways of giving back to any organization. One would be giving your time, so volunteering and donating time. A second would be donating money. And the third would be a product that you either make or create or collect to donate. So we're ideally looking for organizations where we can give back in all 3 ways. That doesn't always happen. There are times where an organization is so compelling and so meaningful to the teens, but really the only thing the organization needs is money, or the only thing they want is, volunteer time. So sometimes that's okay, but ideally we're finding multiple venues. And that's because sometimes when it comes time to give back, the activity of giving back isn't 100% ideal for every participant. And so we want to say, like, if you don't love volunteering your time, at a fundraiser or at a soup kitchen or wherever it is that we're going to volunteer, that's okay, that you can still help this organization. So it's really nice when there are multiple ways. And then below that, you see these 5 boxes that say activities. And this is where the teens brainstorm with us activities of giving back. So what would be some activities that they could do for donating their time to an organization, their money, how could they get money, what kind of fundraisers could they do to make money or collect money, and what kinds of products an organization might need from us. and again, how could we collect them or create those products. And we use this again throughout the year and refer back to it with the teams over and over again. Our theme may be hunger. The organization is, no child should be hungry, and then here are ways that we can give back. We're going to have a bake sale and show up at the 5K and sell the baked goods. We're going to raise some money doing that, and then we're also going to donate food that we've collected. So those might be multiple ways of giving back to one particular organization. So here's an example of the themes this year that the teams selected from. They told us they were really interested in children, so that was the theme, the top box in that organizational chart. So after multiple activities, children kept popping up, and then beyond that, there were some subcategories that really were a dead even tie. So healthcare, education, Israel, and bullying. So as educators met, we said, well, let's combine those themes, and we'll look for organizations and narrow the theme down further so that those four things would still be tied to children in some way. The teams then voted on these initiatives to narrow it down yet further to find actual causes and organizations that they wanted to support and give back to. So here you can see two images that took place in the classroom. The one at the top was a compare and contrast of Magen David Adom, which is the Israeli Red Cross, and the American Red Cross. So the students looked at how they were different. There was some, I can't remember now, there was some sort of game show type game that earned them pieces for each of the sides of the compare and contrast. And here in the classroom you can see this is the organizational chart that had been completed previously. Over here you'll see the schedule of the day is listed for the teams as well, so they can see what's happening during the course of the evening. So this was in the beginning of the unit where the teams were just starting to learn about what the difference was between the two organizations. And then down in the lower right, there's a representative from the Israeli Red Cross that had come to our group, and he spoke to the teams about what they did and how the teams could be supportive to the organization. Once they've decided what they're going to support, they have to figure out how they're going to give back to that organization. So here we have two boys in the top left that are creating a budget for their project. So they're using their phone to look up the costs of things. And in the lower right-hand corner, we have students that were doing the same thing, also creating a budget, but using very different tools. On the chalkboard or the whiteboard here, we have different types of products that they needed to create for their budget, and then the cost of them, it's a little hard to see, the cost of each item is listed below it. And so the teens knew they had about $200 to spend and had to figure out how they would spend that money. And so for some of our students and teams, they needed the visual supports and more of a narrow choice. And other teens were very comfortable hopping on their phones and figuring out exactly what they wanted. And so there was multiple ways of accessing the same end result for the teens. The other thing that often the teens do is write grants to fund their work. So we have a generous donor that has provided some seed money for the teens. So she set aside some money that is intended for our teens to use so that they can do philanthropic work. And so they are requesting money from this fund in order to pay for things for their fundraisers. So you'll see in a few minutes that we had a Zumba-thon and made some greeting cards and fleece blankets to sell to raise money for the Israeli Red Cross. And those things, of course, cost money. It costs money to buy the materials to then sell. And so they wrote a grant to request money to pay for the materials and to pay for the Zumbathon. In addition to that, they then raised money, but this allowed them to have some seed money to start and allowed all of their fundraising efforts to be given back to the organization of choice rather than to come out of their profits, if you will. So here's an image of them donating their time, and this was a literacy unit that we did a couple of years ago. And the organization is called More Than Words, and it's a used bookstore that is in Boston. What's particularly interesting about this bookstore is not only can you get some great books for a really great price, but the bookstore not only employs at-risk youth, but has a whole training program to sort of rehabilitate them before they make bad choices. So there's a cafe in the bookstore, this is downstairs in the bookstore, but there's a cafe where the at-risk youth are employed and a bookstore there as well. And then in the basement is where the at-risk youth are also sorting books, scanning them into the computers, and then filling orders for a lot of Amazon book requests. When you buy a used book on Amazon, it might come from More Than Words. And so our teens went, they met with the at-risk youth that gave them a tour of the facility and then helped them that night with sorting and scanning books and shelving them and things like that. So it was an evening of time where they learned how the bookstore worked, but also learned a little bit about the program for supporting at-risk youth. And here is where it shows an example of teens giving back with materials or a product. So in the top left-hand corner, we did a unit for Birthday Wishes, which is also a local organization that throws birthday parties for children in homeless shelters. So through that unit, the teens did multiple things to support Birthday Wishes. They donated their time by throwing a birthday party. They donated money after doing a fundraiser. They wrote a check to Birthday Wishes. And then they also donated 2 birthday parties worth of materials. So birthday presents and goodie bags and cake mix and frosting and candles and paper goods, everything you would need to throw a birthday party. And Birthday Wishes has some shelters where they have people come in to throw the party and other shelters where visitors are not allowed. And so they need just the birthday supplies to throw the party themselves. So you can see the teens preparing for that. And then below, the teens are assembling dry soup mix to send to the Ukraine for an elder hostel. And so again, they needed seed money to pay for the soup mix, which was great, but then just donated the product and it got sent over to the Ukraine.
I want to just interject something here about the Birthday Wishes, because Nancy mentioned that occasionally our group would go and actually host a birthday party. I mean, just what's important to recognize is that our group was an inclusive group of kids with and without disabilities going to basically run activities and do a magic show for kids in a shelter, for homeless kids in a shelter. I mean, the young man who led the magic show is someone, with a disability. It is not that often that you have, teens with disabilities that are in a position to be able to go and actually do the hands-on volunteering with a different population.
What was also particularly interesting in that unit is we had to do a lot of training around social skills and social thinking so that our teens would be successful in running a birthday party. Unfortunately, the whole group couldn't go and run the birthday party. The shelter just doesn't have that much space, so we could only bring about 5 teenagers with us. But we made sure that we had, a mix of teens with various skills. But throughout the unit, everyone had to learn to create visual support so that the children at the shelter would know how to play the games at the party. The teens created schedule of visual supports so that the kids at the birthday party would know what was coming up and happening, which tends to support all kids and is better for all kids, just having that predictability. And then some of the social skills around what happens if you lose at a game. How would they help a child who might be disappointed if they lost at Pin the Tail on the Donkey, or if they didn't get the color balloon they wanted? Things that often people take for granted, but that kids feel really big and sometimes have really big reactions to. We needed our teens to be able to manage that, both to manage it themselves if there was an upset or disappointment or something unexpected happened, and to help the kids in the shelter. And so for that unit, it went on for almost an entire year. So not only were they learning about why poverty exists and how people become homeless, and why it's important for kids in a shelter to still have a birthday party, but they were learning about the organization, Birthday Wishes, and what they do to give back. And then there was a huge piece on both the life skills and the social thinking skills around birthdays and presents, wrapping a present so it looks nice, how to gracefully accept a present maybe that you don't like was something really important for our kids to understand. And so we spent time on all of these things. We taught them to bake cakes and decorate cakes. So there was a lot of different pieces that went into it. And of course, that gave the teens a lot of things to talk about. There was one night where we spent playing birthday party games that, are intended for, 4-year-olds, like Pin the Tail on the Donkey and musical chairs. And so the teens were old enough and far enough away from playing those games that it was fun to revisit them again and just very silly, and gave them something to talk about with one another. And this particular unit really bonded the group together in a very unique way. And years later, we've repeated the unit a few times, and teens who have participated bring it up again and again as something really meaningful that they did in high school. Here's another example of something that the teens did that was really interesting. A few years ago, we wrote a grant to get money to purchase adaptive bikes. And then these adaptive bikes came to us unassembled, and the teens had to assemble the bikes, and then they got loaded onto a U-Haul, driven across the state, and were donated to an organization that essentially gives bikes to kids with disabilities so that they can ride bikes. So they're sort of adaptive bikes, if you will, and our teens had to figure out how to build them. And so we had to create some accommodations to the instructions. For anyone that's ever put together a bike or furniture from IKEA, you might know it's not always so easy to follow those instructions manuals. So we used some technology. There were some videos online that helped us. We created some visuals ourselves, and we did bring in some adult help for this. But it was also another unique opportunity for teens to build something and work together.
Let's see. And then, as Arlene, as Nancy mentioned before, occasionally the kids actually have fundraisers. They figure out what they can make to sell, or a-thons, as she mentioned, the Zumba-thon.
So here, the teens were planning a fundraiser to raise money, and this was last year. In the picture here where my red dot is, the kids were making cards to turn into greeting cards to sell. So it's not always easy to get anyone who's not naturally artistic to make something nice enough to sell. So in order to make this sort of an accommodation for anyone who is not artistic, regardless of abilities, we got some sort of funky rollers and paints and had the teens fill the page with paint. And then we photographed the pictures very close up, and then those images got printed on greeting cards. So it didn't really matter if you were artistic or not. it was more sort of textural and just sort of funky and cool. And then they bundled the cards at a later date. In the picture on the right, you can see they're creating fleece blankets. So we went to the craft store and bought these kits. Excuse me. And they tied the blankets, and then later we had a fundraiser.
One thing I want to add is, it may not be totally apparent from the pictures, but, this is a very, very inclusive group, and it has a range of teens. Some have, very visible disabilities. Some do not have visible disabilities. Some have identified disabilities. Some do not have identified disabilities. What the teachers make sure to do is make sure that whatever activity is that they're doing is accessible so that there is a way for every single student to feel successful. So if we're making greeting cards, we want to make sure that, there are several kids in the group who, have physical disabilities and are not able to draw in a more traditional manner. We want to make sure we have, adapted the activities so that they are able to fully participate in both art activities in the, when it's a Zumba-thon, we want to make sure it's a fully accessible Zumba-thon. When it's a bubble soccer-thon, we, figured out how we can make that accessible for the students in wheelchairs, etc.
What you can't see in the pictures is the physical adaptations for each of these activities that Arlene's referring to. So for painting, we built up some of the paint brushes for students who have difficulty with fine motor and grasping and releasing things. So there were sort of straps that teens could slip their hands into if they had a hard time holding the rollers and the brushes, and they worked in pairs to do things. And for the fleece blankets, we have both adaptive scissors for cutting. We made markations on the blankets so teens would know where to cut, or teens could choose to not do cutting at all if that was something they didn't like to do, and could participate in working on the blankets in another way. All right, moving ahead. So here's a picture from our Zumba-thon. This was a tough sell for some of the boys that didn't think it seemed cool at first, that even wondered if they should show up that night. But we made it cool and fun, and in the end had all 30 teens, again, both with and without disabilities, doing Zumba, and in this picture doing some, I believe, Moroccan belly dancing. And again, it was something unique and silly and ridiculous enough that everyone had something to talk about. It was a real bonding experience for a lot of them, a place where some of the teens could really show off their dancing skills after years of dance lessons and felt really comfortable doing it. But it gave them something to talk about. And prior to the night, the teens had to fundraise for it and get sponsored to come and dance. And we tell the teens that they can ask neighbors, they can ask family members, they can just donate the money themselves, that we want everyone to donate something, but we don't care what the amount is. So there's no pressure. It's not a competition, but just the idea that everyone is contributing some amount. And I believe in this event we did have 100% participation, which was really exciting for us. And the teens thought it was a really great night. And then finally, after we had sold our fleece blankets and greeting cards and had our Zumba-thon, we invited the representative from the Israeli Red Cross back to our program, where we created a large check for over $1,100. And so the teens were really proud of raising that amount of money, and the representative was really sort of blown away by the group's efforts. Finally, at the end of the year, we always celebrate our successes. So this was these were images from last year's end-of-year celebration. You can just barely see part of this big video game bus on the outside here. What it is, it's like a cool, tricked-out bus. On the outside, it has 3 or 4 large flat-screen TVs attached to video gaming systems. I believe they're Wii the Wii platform, which requires movement. And so groups of teens could play different games. The group of girls here were doing a dancing game, and the boys here were doing, I think, maybe Wii tennis or Wii baseball or something like that. And then inside the bus, you can see there's all sorts of fun lights and visual effects going on. And again, 3 or 4 large flat-screen TVs with Xbox and PlayStations, so the teens could play video games inside. And then beyond the bus, we had some other activities going on. So if someone really wasn't into the video game system, we had other activities and snacks going on. This was a huge hit for the teens. Again, something really novel, even though they play video games at home. Most of them have never seen a bus where 25 or 30 people could all play video games at the same time in the same space. And it was, just a really fun night. Again, something to give them something to talk about, an opportunity to reflect on the year and their accomplishments, and just a lot of fun. In summation, we're all about building skills and forging relationships. I think sometimes teens with and without disabilities lack skills that don't let them fully participate. And again, it doesn't always matter if you have a disability or not. It's lacking a skill makes it difficult sometimes to participate. So we make sure to give the teens the skills they need so that they can participate, or adapt the activities. If there seems to be an obstacle in the way of learning a skill, we adapt it so that everyone can participate in some way. And we try to support them building relationships. We've had teens that have come to us that have been incredibly shy and resistant to joining the group physically, even though they're in the room. And we try and meet them where they're at, both by finding things that they're going to be really motivated and interested in participating in, and just in sharing, again, some of these silly activities. We make sure that the accommodations are there, and the curriculum is really driven and guided by the teens' interests. So we're not just saying that we're going to help kids in a homeless shelter because the adults think that's a good idea. We've got that idea because the teens have told us they're interested in children and helping them. And here's our final slide. You can see they're wearing their Mitzvah Mensches superhero T-shirts. They designed these last year in a T-shirt design contest, and it was a culmination of several ideas. But they have a great time together, and I think learn a lot. This year they are working on their second unit right now. The first unit was for the Jewish National Fund in Israel has something called the Indoor Recreation Center, which is an indoor playground that's protected from missile strikes. And so they fundraised for them, and they raised about $1,000 for that organization. And now we're in the middle of our second unit for Hope and Comfort, which is a local organization that provides toiletries to people in poverty that might not have access. So they're planning fundraisers and going to volunteer at that organization in the next 2 weeks.
So that organization has a warehouse where they put together kits to be distributed to, as Nancy said, people in poverty. So, as we're planning to go there, we're also thinking about how can we make sure that the activity of putting together these kits of, several toothbrushes and toothpaste and shampoo and soaps is something that every student and every teen in our program can do. We have some kids with cerebral palsy who have limited mobility. We, have kids that have some difficulty following directions. So we'll make sure that the directions are prepared in multiple ways. We'll have some visual directions. We'll make sure that it's the activity set up so that the students with mobility issues will be able to, either pair with somebody else to make a kit. We'll find, which part of the kit assembly they're able to do. And even the awareness by, other kids of like, gee, if we're going someplace like that, we have to make sure that the place is handicapped accessible and has ramps, is something that all the kids are now aware of is an important ingredient.
So we are done with this part of the presentation and happy to open it up to any questions people may have at this time.
Arlene and Nancy, I really can't thank you enough on behalf of Respectability. We're just delighted to see what Gateways is doing in this remarkable program that we believe should be replicated. You can see their contact information right here on the screen. Also, you can see my contact information on the screen. But operator, if you can go ahead and let people know how they can ask a question. My understanding is they can do it either online or by telephone. Michelle, how do they go about doing that?
Yes, so if they are on the web, they can submit a question via the chat window, and if they have called in, they can press 7 followed by the hash key in their phone now to queue up for verbal questions.
So now we turn it over to questions. While people are typing in their questions or getting in queue, maybe you can tell us, Nancy, a little bit about some of the types of disabilities that some of these teens had and how they let you know through the intake process what kinds of accommodations and supports would enable them to be successful in your program.
Absolutely. So we have both what I would call visible disabilities and hidden disabilities. So some of the visible disabilities might be things like cerebral palsy or Down syndrome and sometimes autism. And hidden disabilities may be autism or autism spectrum disorders or attention deficit disorders or OCD, things like that teens may or may not want to share with us.
Anxiety.
Some anxiety, things of that nature. Sometimes they're very open with us, and other times they are less open. The recruitment process and finding out about that is the same for all teens at this point. So there's an application that any teen who wants to participate in the program fills out, and anyone here can certainly see that application. It's on our website. If you go to programs, you'll get to the menu where it says Mitzvah Mensches, the name of our program, and it will link you to the application. And we really only ask 1 or 2 questions about if they have any special accommodations. And the majority of students that have a disability, before they apply, we have, at least to this point, found their parent has reached out to us first, either by email or phone, and given us some information. And so we will have more of an in-depth conversation at that point. But if they want to, they can certainly put it down in writing. Typically, we're finding out about more of the nuanced issues of teens on the application. So if someone has a reading disability and doesn't want to be called on to read aloud, or if they have anxiety or certain phobias or fears, or they have Tourette's and want us to be aware if they're, are having tics and how to handle that with the rest of the group. So the rest of the questions on the application are pretty mundane, more about why you want to be part of a group like this, and just sort of the 411 so we know who to contact if there's a problem or how to reach them by email.
Great. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, the recruitment happens through a lot of social media, word of mouth, and our website.
And many of the students with the more identified disabilities have been students in our other programs through the years. When they were younger, they were in our Sunday Jewish educational program. But what's really very different about this is that, unlike our Sunday program where we have students with disability who are paired with neurotypical teens who are acting as their teen volunteer. Here, everybody's a mensch. It's an inclusive youth group. Some kids have visible disabilities. Some kids have invisible disabilities. Some kids do not have any disabilities at all, but everybody's a mensch. Everybody wants to be there to really, participate together in teen philanthropy activities in a really fun and engaging and youth groupy kind of way.
Fabulous. So
we have a few questions on the chat that maybe...
Yes, I know, but before we go there, let me just put in a plug for a couple of things coming up, very exciting. We have a webinar coming up on March 18th that is on federations and how a Jewish community or a community foundation or a United Way can support equality and inclusion beyond and throughout the community agencies. And our guest speakers on March 18th at 1:30 Eastern Time will be Steve Rackett, CEO of the Jewish Federation of Greater Washington, and Lisa Handelsman, who is this amazing inclusion coordinator for the entire Federation system in Greater Washington. And then we have another great program on teens coming up with the DC Jewish Community Center's Community Service Program that is very similar to this, only that it's more intense in that it is a camp program where they do this kind of work over the summer in a day camp type of setting, and they're doing really just direct service, people with and without disabilities that are together. For the questions that are on the web, let me just first of all say that yes, we will be providing you with this PowerPoint presentation so that you can have that. And Rebecca has asked, what is the ratio of neurotypical and teens with special needs, and how do you recruit for the program intake process? You've covered some of that, but maybe you can go in a little more depth.
Sure. The ratio this year is about 1/3 teens with identified disabilities and 2/3 teens without identified disabilities. Of that 2/3 that do not have an identified disability, I know that there are teens that have and need some support, but they, again, are more of those hidden disabilities. Like I know they have some anxiety. We have one student who has Asperger's, whose parent has told me that, but she doesn't identify that way to any of her peers. So things like that may exist. But of identified disabilities, it's about 1/3 to 2/3. And as far as go ahead.
And do these kids go to an inclusion classroom, or are they in segregated classrooms for disability special programs?
It really varies by student to student and the districts that they are in. We have some students that are in private schools that are just for kids with disabilities. We have kids that are in their public schools, both in fully included with some level of support, or go to a resource or learning center, or there may be some special program within their public high schools. And then we have other kids that are, in Jewish day schools that have some support in the Jewish day schools but don't identify as having a disability.
One interesting byproduct of this program that we have found is that there are some teens that are in public school together, but never interacted. Students with identified disability who's been in the same high school as some other kids, but, to be honest, their social worlds never intersected, and suddenly they became friends through Mitzvah Mensches. They had, as Nancy talked about before, they had shared activities, they had shared experiences. Gee, remember last Wednesday night when we played that ridiculous game of, whatever, and kids, and we heard from kids and from parents that these teens were actually interacting at public school, sitting with each other at lunch, which is something that had never happened despite many years of being together in inclusive public school programs. Their social lives never interacted. But in Mitzvah Mensches, which we sometimes call, creating a social life through social action, they actually became true friends and started interacting outside of the program. We also I remember a number of years ago, there was a young woman who, because of Mitzvah Mensches, ended up joining BBYO together with some of the peers, the neurotypical peers who were in Mitzvah Mensches, and she got involved in BBYO only because of that. She never would have gone. This is somebody who had never joined social clubs before. This was her first social interactive experience as a teenager, and it gave her the confidence and the peers to go with to go to BBYO.
BBYO is a youth group that is not specifically for people with disabilities, but it's a much larger youth group sort of setting.
Thank you.
And look at this program. There's a lot of having fun, and there's a lot of silliness. But ultimately, there's a continuum where you're hoping that these teens are going to go into internships in the future, go into employment in the future. How much of a vocational hat do you put on your head when you're doing this program? And what do you find to be helpful when you think about the pre-employment components of this program?
So truthfully, I'm not often thinking about the vocational skills required in a workplace, like using a computer or, filing things, but I am thinking about the social implications in a vocational setting. Because so often I think people with disabilities can get a job doing something vocational with support, but they often lose a job because of social mistakes. I think lagging skills around an actual task is much more tolerated, and employers and fellow employees are much more tolerant of that and remediating that. However, social mistakes, I think, are what really hinder people more often than not in getting along with coworkers or saying things that might offend people. So that we are always consistently thinking about and programming for, planning for, giving the teens the skills to get along with one another and be appropriate in different settings. I have one teenager who frequently will bring up inappropriate things, topics that you would not talk about in front of your teachers or your bosses or your parents, but things that would be perfectly acceptable to talk about with your friends when you're in your room alone or at the movies or hanging out. And so we've done a lot of work with this teen about, let's come up with topics that are appropriate for this setting, and let's discuss the topics that you have to save for outside of this setting. And that you can discuss the, inappropriate jokes if you want to with friends from this program, but not while you're at this program. And so we are always thinking about that.
Right. So, operator, are there any more questions? Can you describe again one more time how people can do it on the phone and how people can just type in their questions? We have just a couple more moments.
Absolutely. Again, if you have called in, please press 7 followed by the hash key on your phone now to queue up for verbal questions, or continue to submit chat questions on the lower left corner of your presentation window.
And as people are doing that, if I can just ask our friends from Gateways, if people want to get to start their own program like this, what would your advice be about how you can start a program like this on your own?
I think there's some simple things you can do. If you have groups of people, whether they're teenagers or children or adults, that are coming together to do anything, whether it's a philanthropic youth group or has some other goal or mission, I think there's simple things you can do to structure it for success so that everyone can participate. And the first would be to think about, how easy it is to daydream and lose track of words, and to sort of put the important things that are being said in writing. So that means schedules being made available or agendas of meetings being made available, if possible, in advance so that people can be prepared and know what to expect. That will eliminate anxiety and nervousness. Structure things to limit the amount of downtime and sort of free chat at the beginning of events. That can be really off-putting for people, I believe, with disabilities and those without that have a hard time just walking into a room and not knowing where to sit and what to do. So I think that free time in the beginning would be better saved for later in the evening, and instead structure the start of your programs much more so. And then to think about, for every activity you're doing, how you would access this activity if you couldn't see, if you couldn't hear, if you had trouble communicating or had a physical challenge. Most often, there's a pretty simple accommodation that can be made. We've had a few times where we haven't done an activity because we didn't feel that we could make appropriate accommodations so that everyone would be successful. And other years, we've said we're going to try and do this anyway and let people know that, this might be difficult, and that's okay if they want to participate for part of the time or in some way, but not always. So I think flexibility is really key. And then just an open dialogue. And we have an open dialogue with our teens at the start of the year, and we do an activity about just differences and being accepting of differences and acknowledging people's abilities and just being able to sort of help out when someone isn't able to do something.
Well, I want to thank you again. It was really a delight to have you. I don't see any other questions at this time, but I want to really remind everybody that we have a couple more webinars coming up soon. We have Steve Rackett and Lisa Handelman coming up from the Jewish Federation of Greater Washington, making an entire community and all its agencies very inclusive of people with disabilities. We have the DCJCC Pre-Employment Community Service Teen Program coming up with Erica Steen, and we're looking forward to that very, very much on March 22nd. I want to thank Arlene Rams and Nancy Mager, and I want to thank Gateways and our operator, all for being with us today. And for those of you who tuned in with us, I want to remind you that we will be putting the PowerPoint up on our website, so it will be available to you. And I want to thank Hillary Steen from our team in-house for helping coordinate this. Nancy and Arlene, thank you for a terrific job, and thank you again, all of you who joined us. This concludes our webinar.
The moderator